Buonasera a tutti. Good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners. Also, be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past video interviews. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo. Grazie per essere con noi anche oggi, mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. Today, it's an honor to welcome Maria Laurino, a distinguished voice in Italian-American literature, whose works have deepened our understanding of cultural identity and history. Her poignant storytelling and historical insights have shed light on the multifaceted journey of Italian Americans, making her an indispensable figure in contemporary literature and cultural discourse. From Were You Always in Italian, which examines stereotypes and cultural heritage, and Italian Americans, a history, a companion book to the PBS series of the same name, to The Price of Children, Maria showcases her unique ability to tell stories that resonate across generations. So stay tuned, don't go anywhere, ma prima pubblicità. Parli italiano? You want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring in person or online to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at istitutomondoitaliano.org. Good morning, Maria. How are you today?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So I'm sure that people are very familiar with you and your work and your contribution. Again, as we said, to understand better the experience, the journey of the Italian Americans. And I actually would like to take our viewers and listeners through a journey of the work that you have shared with us. So the first question might sound a cliche. Were you always an Italian?
Well, thank you. I love that question. There's an interesting history behind it, which I'll share because it informs the title of the book. So the simple answer to your question, no, the complex answer to your question is no, I wasn't always an Italian. But I learned to embrace my ethnic identity. This book was my first book, and it was a product of just years of and childhood experience growing up in an area that was very kind of waspy, not Italian at all, and feeling the weight of stereotypes. My mother telling the story of when we moved into our neighborhood. This was back in the 1960s. Things were very different back then, of people saying, oh, another Italian family's on the block. That kind of feeling. When I was in 7th grade, I had a lot of vowels in my name, as you pronounce so beautifully, but in my school, that was strange. That was an anomaly. And I'll never forget a teacher calling the roll for class. And I was a very shy girl. And I said, here, but she didn't hear me. And so she just stared at me and said, do you speak English? And of course, the whole class burst into laughter. I was mortified. So I carried this with me, this sort of feeling. And then at the same time, the Godfather movies were becoming very popular. And so the whole mafia myth and of that Italian Americans were intricately linked to the mafia was just so it was just so persistent at that time, and it was very troubling to me. So anyway, I was a journalist in New York. I was working for the Village Voice, and I had a wonderful assignment, which was to interview the former governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, and I wanted to try to place him in an ethnic cultural tradition. And I was reading a lot about, well, obviously Fiorello LaGuardia, the great mayor of New York, but also one of his mentors, a very liberal East Harlem congressman named Vito Marcantonio, a wonderful educator in Harlem named Leonard Covello. These were really Italian-American heroes of the 30s and 40s. And I was wondering if they had at all influenced the then governor. And so I was asking him these questions, and he looked at me and said, were you always an Italian? And I thought that was a brilliant question. I thought it could be asked of any ethnic group. because particularly when I was growing up, today identity is a much more relevant issue in our political discourse, but it wasn't then. And the idea was you had to assimilate. You had to become part of the melting pot, right? That's what it was. And so it was very hard to claim that part of your ancestry. So and with very guiltily, I shook my head no. And he said, oh, I know all about ethnic self-hate. And he began to tell me how he was tied for #1 in his law school class. And the dean looked at him and said, well, if you want a job on Wall Street, change your name. You're never going to get a job with the vowels in your name. And when he said that, it was a great relief to me that I not only wasn't alone, but this very distinguished man, who could have been my father, was giving me this advice and sharing his feelings of this kind of ethnic self-hate that was attached to stereotypes and his amazing ability to transcend that. So I thought that, and that was really the theme of Were You Always an Italian, looking at these different issues of class and stereotype and how it affects Italian-American identity. So anyway, I thought it was such a brilliant question. I made that the title of my book. So that's a long answer to your question.
It is indeed brilliant. So the book discusses stereotypes and challenges of assimilation, as you have said before. And what are some of the most significant misconceptions about Italian Americans that you hoped to address?
Well, I think definitely the mafia stereotype. I remember at the time, in the 80s, I was in college. I was at Georgetown, and still it felt like a new thing for Italian Americans to come into their own. And I remember a friend, and he was a good friend, and he didn't even realize that it was insulting. Like every time he saw an Italian with money, he'd say, "You think the mafia?" And it was that kind of thing that was very pervasive. At least in the world that I was in at that time. That's how I perceived it. Others, may not have felt that way. Intellectual stereotypes, this idea of having the vowels at the end of your name kind of marked you in a way in kind of high academic circles, that kind of thing. And then also the book was just kind of an observation about culture and how we make the culture part of us. Like, for example, one of my favorite chapters in that book was a chapter on clothes. And I was using that to talk about class and identity. And I was comparing the contrasting aesthetics of Giorgio Armani and Gianni Versace. My mother always wanted me to be the Giorgio Armani girl. Not that we could afford to, but that was her aspiration, sort of the beige tones of Milan. Even though, of course, we're completely Southern Italian. And Versace, it personified that exuberance of the South, and that kind of over-the-top nature in his wild colors, much sexier. Armani was very kind of dignified. And so I was looking at those kinds of issues of class, issues of perceptions of the North and South of Italy through something as fun as clothes, and thinking about how you dressed and how you are perceived in the world.
So just a little bit off the tangent, you have gone to Italy, I would have assumed, and I was wondering if you had any trips to Italy before you started to dive into this Italian-American experience and then reflect, that it was no longer a vacation, but it was almost like a research.
Yes.
Or so if you can just kind of
no, that's a great question. The first time I had been to Europe was my brother's 8 years older than I am. He treated me for my college graduation, because neither of us had ever been to Europe, that we would make a trip there and do it through Euro-rail passes and pensions. And I was the English major in college. And so I wanted to go to London. I wanted to be in Bloomsbury. I love Virginia Woolf. I wanted to be there in Russell Square. And I loved it. And Chaucer, I studied Chaucer. And so I loved it. And I loved England. And it was intellectually really satisfying. But when we went to Italy, when we went to Rome, I felt like I woke up. I was like, wait, this is one of the most magnificent cities I've ever seen. Where are these stereotypes coming from? These stereotypes that have entered our life in the United States, which, clearly all of the ignorance behind it. And I fell in love with Rome. And I just wanted nothing more than to spend time there and continue to travel there, try to, find my way there. Like every summer, I became friends with an Italian journalist who worked for the WWII, and she was a great guide to me. And it was so, so eye-opening. And really from that trip, I realized that I needed to write this book. It really came from that. And then when I did receive the contract to write the book, I finally made the trip to visit. I still have ancestors in a small town outside of Avellino called Conza della Campagna. And I spent a week time with them. And then I went to my father's family is from Picerno in Basilicata. His family we couldn't trace anyone. So I just got the sense of being there. And then and the ending of my book is about my time and this kind of mirror image, which was really interesting, that my grandfather came to America. His brother stayed behind. He was nervous about making the journey. My grandfather always wanted him to come. So I was staying with his family, and all the names were mirrors. They had named their children their same names. And so my mother, Connie, who of course was Concetta, but changed her name to Connie, Constance Connie in the United States.
Yeah.
I stayed at the house of Concetta. It was so, so deeply meaningful. And I also learned another thing, which is another favorite chapter of mine of Where You Always in Italian, about dialect, about words. Because my parents didn't speak to us in any form of Italian because they spoke dialect and they knew it wasn't the real Italian. So we had no basis for the language, but I had all of these dialect words that I just loved and my mother used all the time. But I didn't have a dictionary to look them up in. I didn't really know what they were. I was a little out of it. My mother would say, "You're stunad," and I'd say that to my Roman friend, and she'd be like, "What are you talking about? That word doesn't exist." So when I was there in the South, I interviewed a linguist in Naples who was also from the same region as my family. And he went through all the roots and the meanings of these dialect words and where they, what they're derived from. And then to my mother's great disappointment, we connected her by telephone to her cousin, Concetta, and they couldn't understand each other. And my mother was heartbroken because my mother was speaking in the dialect she remembered from her mother, which isn't really even Southern dialect. It's like a Southern Italian American dialect, ancient language. 19th century language. So that was really, really interesting too, to think about the language and the dialect and the roots of all of that.
Yeah, because I think you dedicated also some, a chapter in one of your publications, and maybe this one about these dialect words and kind of from stunado back to stonato. Stonato is out of tune, so maybe
exactly
no sense and so forth. And sometimes we have to read it a couple of times to hear it and then kind of trace it back where that might have become like household language, in the Italian Americans here, families here. And talking about the beginnings of the story, indeed, the Conza della Campagna, you do talk about Michele Conte, and then unfulfilled love, and a sense of honor. Can you tell us a little bit about that honor system, who he had to marry versus who he wanted to marry?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a very sad story on many levels. A story told to me by my mother and my aunt, her sister, that he married my great grandmother, but he was in love with her sister. But I guess, went ahead with the marriage. But then he ended up, I believe the story is that he ended up having a child with the sister, I think he had a child with the sister, yes. And my great grandmother, of course, was beside herself. And then according to the kind of family lore, family legend, he ended up placing her in a kind of, I guess she was in such anguish that he put her in a mental institution or whatever version that was in the South, run by nuns. And she kind of spent her days weaving lace. And it was just such a heartbreaking story on just so many levels. I wish I could know those stories. I wish I could have, met some of these. And my grandparents, my grandmother died when I was 5 years old, so I didn't even have that kind of contact with any of my grandparents. So all of those stories were just kind of passed along to me by my mother and her sister and whatever I could learn from my father's side of the family. But yeah, a lot of pain and suffering, and poverty. It was really that's why they left. They were just impoverished.
Mm-hmm. So let's fast forward to 2014. The PBS series, The Italian Americans, comes out. And I believe you are indeed part of it. And you are then asked to craft a companion book that kind of stands alone, but also complements the documentary. Can you tell us both experiences, tell us a little more about both experiences being in the documentary and then create something that could also, as I said, be on its own?
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, an absolutely wonderful experience. It was such a great documentary team. They were it was a 4-part documentary. They had done years of research and years of trying to get funding. It was very, very hard for them to get funding for this documentary. But they finally did and were able to do the 4 hours. John Maggio, who was the director, is just such a wonderful, thoughtful guy. And he came to my house for the interview. I had been working with several of the other producers who were also really wonderful in meeting them early on, sort of talking about, they had asked me to talk about in the 4th part of the documentary, more of them up to modern times, and these because they knew I was like writing about Italian American identity. So that's what they were asking me about. So anyway, but John Maggio came to the interview and had asked me afterwards if I might be interested in writing a companion book. And I was just delighted by the ask, by this idea of an assignment, if that was going to work out, because it was I always was very interested in documentary, and so it'd be really great fun to be part of it. So anyway, they called a few months later, yes, and we began to go ahead with the project. And it was very, very tight. I only had about a year because they were close to finishing the documentary. So I was literally working 7 days a week, just doing research. I teach at NYU, so I have access to the NYU library, and I was just there all the time. But the way I was able to do that in such a short amount of time was that the scaffolding, I would call it, was already done. I mean, the documentary had been laid out. They gave me all of the chapters of how they were breaking up each part. And then I did my own supplementary research to all of those chapters, plus had access to all of the wonderful scholars they had interviewed and all of the transcripts to that. And then I would read the books that would to go along with those words and those transcripts and other wonderful interviews that they had done, that combination was just great. And also I have to say, I love writing. That's what I've done my whole life, but it's a very solitary experience, and it gets a little lonely. And working on the documentary was like, wow, I get to talk to people. This is really exciting, because I was constantly working and in touch with the producers and saying, well, I'm doing this. Are you good with it? We were all kind of coordinating as it was the companion book. So I think I ended up adding 1 chapter about Italian American counterculture, kind of centered in San Francisco, that they didn't have time to do in the documentary. But other than that, it's extremely faithful to the documentary. I'm just, one of the things that John had said to me was, even with 4 hours, that's nothing compared to a book, right? You're never going to have, exactly. And that's what he wanted. And that's what I was hoping or trying to do.
Well, you mentioned before that there were some issues securing funding. And I think John Maggio was actually pretty open about the fact that even those people in support of promoting the Italian American culture somehow would misassociate again, this production with the theme of mafia. The opening trail shows us I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. I have 2 questions for you. One, you have elaborated in the past of, this is not a new phrase, but unfortunately it's the one that's stuck in popular culture. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about where your researcher has what your researcher has unveiled about the origin of that expression. But I really actually would like to focus on different themes which are typical of the Italian American experience, which is resilience and ambition. So let's go with the catchy phrase first, the origin, and then maybe if you can elaborate more on, and again, on how this theme of resilience, ambition shape your approach to telling this broader community story.
Yeah, well, there's actually, right, Mario Puzo, he, oh, he was referencing, there's an actual origin in Homer. There's a variation of that line, I'll make you an offer I can't refuse. And, and Puzo was, oh my goodness, it was a French writer who he found that from, but I'm actually at a blank right now.
Okay, I'll come to you. It always happens. So he also got inspired by someone else.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Which I could look up, but I need my book. Right, something 10 years ago. But what really did strike me was that you could even find a variation of this
Yeah.
in Homer, in the Iliad.
So let's talk about the good, strong themes, resilience and ambition. So how that is portrayed maybe in themes that you have used to tell again a broader community story.
Well, I mean, I think it takes a certain kind of person to be an immigrant, right? It's quite a harrowing journey to get here. And they're never welcome. We're living through this now, but we weren't particularly welcome back then. When my grandparents came to it, both sets of my grandparents, there was no law, there was no quota restriction. That happened with the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924 because Congress was worried about too many Italians coming, too many Southern Europeans, too many Jews from Eastern Europe, and they put that law into effect. So, but it was harrowing, and I do think it, and even the split in my own family of my grandfather kind of begging his brother and his brother not wanting to leave the land. So it takes, I think, a particular kind of resilience to be an immigrant and also to then plant your roots here, being so alone and trying to find a new community. There's a social scientist, her name is Pauline Boss. She wrote a book called Ambiguous Loss. To her, ambiguous loss is loss, she defines as loss without closure. And she talks about various circumstances in life where you can experience this loss without closure. But the interesting backstory to her research is that she developed this thesis and this idea from watching the depression of her father, who was a Swiss immigrant, who moved to the Midwest and never got to see his mother again, because he never got back to Switzerland until she was on her deathbed. So that's a resilient person. Immigrants are resilient. And I think that characteristic has remained among Italian, in the Italian American psyche. And Italian Americans, I think economically have done extremely well. They have found their way into American life and culture. And we've been here for a long time now. But I think there has been great achievement among the ethnic group.
Indeed. So, the journey to America, in your opinion, I want to look at it also from the perspective of people that are still in Italy, okay, that never immigrated. They might have had relatives, but they are the ones still living in the peninsula. So what do you think is really their perception or actual knowledge of the Italian American experience? Do you feel that is justly represented, underrepresented, over romanticized? Because again, you have gone to Italy and also as an Italian American talking to Italians, and did you find you were, so to speak, speaking the same language, or they kind of not really getting it? So I'm asking your opinion on
Yeah,
that.
no, I think it's another excellent question. I've thought about this a lot myself, because I think one of the frustrations that many Italian Americans feel, particularly those of us who have really embraced the culture and love Italian culture, and I see, I want to get to Italy as much as I can. That is my favorite place to be. And what's always very hard for us is that they think of us as just American, that's their perception because we don't speak the same language, and language is key. And of course, the cultures are very different that we grew up in, obviously. we're a much more Anglo-Saxon culture, and we did not grow up in Italy. But what I always say to them is, I'm completely genetically Italian. All four of my grandparents came from the south of Italy. So you have to understand that some of my emotional composition, my, crying when I laugh, crying like at the drop of a hat, I'm very emotional. I am convinced this is my genetic makeup. So yeah, I think they're really not placing much on nature, and they're putting all the emphasis on nurture. So they see us as just very American, which is and is again, I think, some great frustration of some of us who would like to feel that we are we are also Italian, but it's not really perceived that
Yeah,
way.
because I mean, obviously the language is very important, and probably I had the same attitude when I first came to the United States, straight from Rome, even though I traveled throughout Europe. I mean, no one was really claiming to be Italian as strongly as, for instance, the Italian Americans. I'm sure it's the same thing in Latin American, where you have the Argentinians, the Brazilians, Italian, and so forth. So also we Italians take it for granted. I mean, we don't, put too much on it. But then you see that people and scholars have invested so much in digging, studying, creating literature, and I think they're missing out on, as people here have educated themselves on Italy and the Italian American experience. I think it should also be from the Italians as well, because these musical genre, there is so much that has shaped the Italian American experience, that again, they're missing out. They have to create a little bit of curiosity. And then also in Italy, you have also the children of people that are born in Italy, but maybe not from Italian parents. And because of the citizenship laws of, that is related to blood, you have people that speak the language, but might come from different, and they are not entitled to citizenship yet. They can obviously apply when they become 18. So it's just kind of,
Yeah,
it's a complex, it's a complex question. So
it is. I think we can learn from each other. I think Italians can learn something about the immigrant experience, thinking about, what happened with us, but it's not,
yeah.
that history is not particularly shared. And I agree. I have friends who, for example, are Italian, who teach, the University of Milan, teach Italian American literature. And there's not an interest. There's not a departmental interest in this, which is very disappointing and frustrating too.
So hopefully things will change so that we can really connect, because again, we're branches from the same tree. We just have gone in different directions. And also I've been here long enough where I'm Italian and American because of the dual citizenships. And I try to, in certain things, I'm very Italian. For other things, my Italian family say, oh, you have become Americanized, So, non sono più né carne né pesce, where you say I'm not meat nor fish anymore. I'm somewhere in between. So let's hear from our sponsors, and then we'll move to talk about the price of children. Un caffè, per favore. My first cup of coffee sets the tone for my entire day, and I get my coffee at La Prima Espresso. La Prima has been brewing Pittsburgh's best coffee for over 35 years. Try any of their in-house roasted variety of beans from all over the world at home, or come and enjoy an espresso or a cappuccino at any of their locations, where their friendly baristas and familiar faces will make you feel at home. Visit laprima.com to get La Prima Espresso coffee at your door. I thought we should just have a trivia question for the Italians to figure out on Italian Americans and see if so. But anyway, so now we are moving to a publication with stories that are going to leave us pondering about many, many different topics. So Stolen Lives in a Land Without Choice, The Price of Children. And Maria, would you like to introduce it with maybe reading a couple of pages from it? And
Sure.
And then we'll dive into what the book is about and how this story crossed your path.
Okay. This is actually chapter 1, so we'll start right at the beginning. Turin, 1963. The handsome city that greeted Francesca from the train station, with its elegant arched porticos and wide boulevards humming with prosperity, should have awakened something within the pretty, dark-haired 23-year-old arriving from a small provincial town in southern Italy. At another moment in Francesca's life, the Po River would have beckoned her to wander along its edge as it glittered golden in the midday sun. In another time, Francesca would have entered one of the city's famous centuries-old cafes, replete with gilded mirrors and marble floors, inhaling the experience in the joyful fashion of the discovering young, with long breaths and beating heart. But when Francesca arrived in Turin that spring, the season of her disappearance had begun. The previous fall, Francesca had worked as an olive picker in Puglia, one of a long line of peasant farmers who for centuries harvested this local crop to be pressed into oil. She gently shook the branches of the small trees, coaxing the plump ripe olives onto the tarp beneath her feet. It was tedious work, the days long and hot, but one night she earned a small reward. Her boss, whom she had a crush on, offered her a ride home. Francesca was delighted, but hadn't anticipated the route her boss would take, down to the Azure Sea, stopping at a thatched trullo, the traditional stone hut of the region. This particular trullo, run as a bar and inn, had its own tradition among the local men. At first, she tried to hide from her mother her slowly changing body, denial the only strategy for what had happened that night. By 4 months, however, their small house, bulging and swelling with shouts and recriminations, felt ready to burst. Francesca listened, but could no longer heard, cocooned in her own thoughts and desires. One thing was clear: she had no choice but to leave the village. The train ride to Turin was excruciating, over 15 hours in a stuffy carriage clambering north. In the tight space of the enclosed cabin, Francesca sat opposite her older brother, a carabinieri stationed north, who had traveled back home, determined to bleach out the stain now saturating the family. She stared out the window at the arid land, endless swaths of honey and brown, that became a misty blur as her brother unleashed his fury. Disgraziata, his demeaning reproaches declared in the name of moral authority and fraternal duty, hung in the air with a heavy, nauseating sweetness, like a cheap cigar. You are the ruin of our family. Then she ends up at a home for unwed mothers. And I'll just read from here. But the season turned to fall when Francesca was sent to Turin's maternity hospital in a special section reserved for sinful women. The woman who carried her baby for 9 months, who bore through torturous labor a son Piero, a name she had chosen months before, who nursed him for a precious few days, and who desperately wanted to keep him, was about to be erased. On the floor of the maternity ward, she had a name and a child, but 4 days later, she possessed neither. In the days and years ahead, she would need to find another chamber in her heart, one devoid of the unbearable grief of relinquishing her firstborn son. Her Italian son's birth certificate, sealed from prying eyes for the next century, preventing mother from ever learning about son, and ensuring that son could never find his mother, read, "Nato di donna che non consente di essere nominata," born of a woman who does not consent to be named. It didn't matter that Francesca remained in Turin for 3 more years to be near her baby, working as a nanny for a wealthy couple and imagining Piero in the face of the little boy she nurtured. It made no difference that Francesca repeatedly returned to the gates of the family home, seeking to take back her child. "Make peace, woman," the Mother Superior finally told her, determined to put an end to the visits. "Your child has been sent to America. He is with a good family." Nothing mattered because Francesca was now a ghost. In the eyes of the church, nameless and childless, she had officially disappeared.
Thank you for the reading, Maria. We're going to dive into our conversation. So, how did Francesca's story enter your life? What was your personal connection to kind of unveil these stories?
It was completely serendipitous. It was a phone call on a Saturday morning. I was sitting here in my apartment, putting off going to the gym, and I get a call from my cousin, who was actually asking me for advice about having to navigate 2 airports in New York City. He was trying to make a connecting flight to get to Milan from South Florida. And during the course of the conversation, he said, "Oh, and by the way, I joined this adoption group for people like me." We always knew my cousin was adopted. He's my age, and we just didn't really know the mechanism of which he was adopted. But we always thought it was kind of interesting that we had a cousin adopted from Italy, because that was kind of rare to have Italian babies adopted into American homes. So he said, I said, well, what is this group? He said, well, for children like me, we're adopted by American couples, part of this Catholic program. And then he started to tell me stories that he had been hearing from other adoptees, stories about birth mothers and about their children that were really disturbing, stories, like Francesca's. And at one point he blurted out, can you imagine my birth mother could be alive and not even know I exist? And I said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I'm hearing that some mothers were even told that their baby had died, to kind of smooth this mechanism to take the children from unwed mothers. So anyway, I had a journalist instinct. I was like, oh my God, I need to find out more about this. I immediately thought of, because I was deeply touched by the film Philomena, the story of Ireland's Magdalene Laundries and a determined mother named Philomena who wanted to find her son who was taken from her because she was an unwed mother and she was in the Magdalene Laundries. And I couldn't believe it. I said, wait a minute, this happened in Italy too? I've never heard this. And indeed, it was a story that had never been told. So I asked my cousin he's running to get his flight. I'm like, no, don't hang up. How can I find out more about this? And he put me in touch with this wonderful man named John Campitelli, who happens to be Francesca's son. You get to that a little later in the book. I gave that away, but and who runs this group for Italian American adoptees and has done tremendous work. And from that, I say with investigative journalism, it's always a little bit of luck and then a lot of work. And that was a little bit of luck. And then a lot of work but also to my great fortune, because I would not have been able to do this otherwise, because this program was run by the Vatican and the American Catholic Church. The documents were not only all in English, which made it allowed for me to do this research, but we're actually in Manhattan, very near where I live. So I spent 3 months, the summer months, in the archives, going through all of these documents and photographing them. And then my travels to Italy began to meet some of the people who were intimately involved in this program.
So obviously the research and finding stories, tell us a little bit how that affected you, because I'm sure that was a pretty emotional process as well. And also if you have been able to meet either in addition to your cousin, some of the children that were adopted or some of the mothers, and what's the challenge for the research for someone to go and locate their birth parents?
Yeah, I think the hardest single thing for me was the pain of the stories. They were really, really hard to process and to live with. For the Italian interviewing birth mothers and adoptees, because I did also speak, because the book has come out it actually came out in Italy first. It's an interesting
I was
thing.
going to ask you that. Yeah.
And which is unusual, but the Italians were particularly interested in the story. So the Italian version also is a little bit longer and has a version of some Italian adoptees too, not of all of which I included in the American edition. But I needed a translator, and I do tell the story to give a sense of the kind of the depth of the pain that all of us, involved in this felt. We were interviewing this Italian adoptee who lives near Naples today, and her story was so harrowing that I'm waiting for the translator to interpret it for me, and she starts to cry in the middle of the Zoom interview. And I thought, oh my God, what is coming? My translator is now in tears. But it was that kind of pain, we felt. Talking another Italian adoptee, I interviewed again with the help of a translator, whose the story just was the hardest one for me. That her birth mother not only was told that her child had died, that she never knew she had a daughter, but she then went to another home for unwed mothers run by nuns where they were learning trade. Again, these existed throughout Italy, the homes for unwed mothers and these institutions known as a brevitrofio, which were the institutions for the children, for these, what they call illegitimate children, the children of the unwed mothers, throughout the country. And there's very, very little discussion about this in Italy, which is another thing that just fascinates me. So this birth mother not only was believed that her child had died, but when she went to this other home, several young mothers were asking about their babies because they were also told that their babies had died, and the grief that they were going through. So the nuns there, in this attempt to provide a kind of closure, brought three of them, this was in Bergamo in northern Italy, three of them to a cemetery in Bergamo and took them to fake graves to mourn babies that were in fact given up for adoption, at least in the case of the woman who I interviewed. And that one really had me in tears. I was just the cruelty of it in the name of believing they were doing something that was right. I want to believe that the nuns thought they were doing something that was, morally correct, was just unbelievable. So that was really, really hard, listening to these stories and the pain that both carried by birth mothers who were lied to, who were tricked into signing forms they didn't understand. Since the book has come out, adoptees have been in touch with me and sharing more documents. And, I'm learning that Home for Unwed Mothers in Rome, the women were all nameless because they wanted, it was encouraged to surrender your child anonymously, because then it's harder to trace for adoption. So they're all coming and being in these homes, and they've lost everything. They're not even called by their names by the people who work there. And it's just so mind-boggling to think about how this happened and how women were shamed and treated.
So it looks like they also they played on their illiteracy, or maybe not ability to, because they signed papers. It looked like somehow they were signing papers, but the women were not really aware what they were signing.
Right. Illiteracy, or also just not being aware.
Just
It's a birth mother who had twins, obviously two, they're twins, had twins in a brevitrovio in Milan. And the social worker asked if she could use some help. And she said, oh, yes, I could use some help. And then they brought her to a notary public. And when they say sign a form, and that you just, sadly, I've signed things that I hadn't read. I mean, not anything of that weight, but I mean, and she is being told what to do, and she signs the form. And the next thing she knows, her children are gone. Yeah. So it was also just following orders. It's like, you're nervous. Oh, here, sign here. Okay, I'll sign here.
Yeah, good faith that the children are going to take care of. And this program, is it just for legitimate orphans? What was the definition of orphan? Did that kind of change over time?
Well, that was really interesting. It was called originally the War Orphan Program. And because they needed a legal mechanism. The country needed a legal mechanism to get the children to the United States. And the legal mechanism was the Displaced Persons Act that came after World War II. The original Displaced Persons Act defined a, quote, war orphan as a child under 16 who had lost both parents to the war. In 1950, an amendment was added to the Displaced Persons Act, which changed the definition of a war orphan to a child who had one parent who had died or was missing or was unable to provide care. In that definition of unable to provide care, which described every Italian man who was part of this program just walked away, there was great latitude. So the children were all called war orphans, and then as the years went on, orphans, but they were neither. There were actually very few war orphans that ever came to the United States, unless they were from mostly Eastern Europe. They were 12 or 14. If you think about it, you're a baby, your parents die in the war from bombings or whatever, and the baby survives. It doesn't intuitively make sense. And then the American government did a study and found actually very few war orphans existed. But it was they were linguistically constructed orphans. It's if you tell a couple that they're going to adopt a war orphan or an orphan, you're giving them a mission along with their need and desire for adoption. No one's saying, you're adopting an illegitimate child from an unwed mother in Italy, So that's how the program was packaged.
And talking about the packaging, there was also a price per child, right? So I think I had read the church charged $475 per child. And did I go and scout for other children in other areas or countrysides that you're aware of?
Yes, and
proactively?
that price is with inflation. That's about, today would be around $5,000. There is certainly the price of children, as I say. I actually believe that the the money was not the motivating factor. I think that the shaping of deciding the church's kind of decision of who should have a child and who should not, that the morality, the moral factor was much more of the deciding opinion. That, this was a time where women had, I mean, they had just gotten the right to vote in 48. They had like no rights. Birth control was not only illegal, but a fascist law was still in place that that you could actually be imprisoned for possession of birth control, or for anybody who was telling someone how to get birth control. So these were really, really choiceless women. And they were, the decisions were being made, I think, on their behalf. And then you have the stigma. There's a wonderful new film out, going back to the Magdalene Laundries, called Small Things Like These, which is based on the Claire Keegan novel, which is also a wonderful book. And it's with Cillian, why am I blanking on Cillian's fabulous actor's last name? Murphy. And it's about how society becomes complicit in the kind of moral the church dictates of the time. So if you get the message that it's a disgrace, and that was the word that was used. That was the word that was used by the woman who was the orphan supervisor who worked with this Monsignor Landi out of Rome, sending children to the United States. It was a disgrace to be an unwed mother. Well, then society also complies, right? And that's why you have parents turning against daughters, siblings turning against daughters, like I described in that.
Yeah, it's a strong word. Yeah, it just portrays the shape right away. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so all of that takes place. And what you have are choiceless women really forced into these situations.
So we're going to go into another commercial, but I'll leave you a couple of minutes to think about, maybe we can talk a little more about how your cousin's experience maybe might be different, because I believe he also lived in Italy, and maybe some other story, some other person that you would like to share with us, whether you were able to be part of the reconnection between a child and their mother, and how that experience went. Okay.
Sure.
Buon Natale from Woolies. The holiday season makes your feast of the 7 fishes unforgettable with the freshest seafood in town. From succulent shrimp and tender calamari to the finest bacala and clams, Woolies has everything you need for your holiday tradition. And mark your calendar for December 14th as we welcome Chris Fenimore into Woolies for our annual Feast of the 7 Fishes cooking demo at 10 o'clock. Watch as he prepares 2 traditional Feast of the 7 Fishes dishes with a sample or 2 for you. This event is free and open to the public. We can't wait to see you at Woolies in the Strip District. We'll talk about some holiday traditions in a little bit, but yes, let's elaborate a little bit about your cousin experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he likes to travel to Italy. He hasn't lived in Italy, but he likes to take these sort of long solo bike rides throughout the country. He has this kind of magnetic pull. Every adoptee's experience is singular, obviously, and some want to find their birth mothers and others don't. And he was one who, in the end, decided he didn't want to. I asked him if he wanted to do this journey as I was doing the book, and he decided not to. He's from Steubenville, Ohio, which I decided to focus a section of my book on, because I thought it was a really interesting look at American adoptees. For some reason, 2 places in the United States, Pueblo, Colorado, and Steubenville, Ohio, received a proportionally large cluster of children from Italy. Not really sure why. There must have just been a very close connection between Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Steubenville with this Vatican program run in Rome by this man named Monsignor Landi, and then in New York to place the children in the United States. So Steubenville has over 24 children who come from the Brevetrophy, which is really rather astounding. And there, as several said to me, it completely blows our minds. they're learning as they've joined John Campitelli's adoption group that the person, the boy who they stood in line waiting for the school bus with, the girl who sat next to them in high school choir, actually all had this unbelievably kind of interesting and very unique Italian past that they actually all shared. So I did a Zoom call with like 5 of the Steubenville adoptees to have them talk about their stories and share. And I talked about this distinction between looking for your parents, birth parents or not, in a discussion one of them had, where one of the adoptees said, I always wondered if I had any siblings, but I just didn't want to open that can of worms. And another adoptee shot back, oh, I'm a can opener. I'm going to open that damn can, because he spent his whole life trying to find his birth mother. He still hasn't. And so it was, I kind of put it into that school. It's like, do you want to open? There are certain adoptees who believe that the first chapter of your life is your birth, and that that they want to possess this. They want to have knowledge of this in order to, understand themselves and the world. Or they're also very anxious to meet family. They want to meet family in Italy. And there's another school of the don't open the can that feels things are good enough. I'm very happy with my experience. Very, wonderful adoptive parent. I also want to add that practically every adoptee I talked to who were looking for their birth parents, from John Campitelli to a man named Marco in Steubenville, who said he wanted to open that damn can. They had wonderful experiences with their adoptive parents, and they loved their parents. And this was never a rejection at all in that way. And they had adoptive parents who were very supportive of them finding their birth families. But they just felt that this was this missing piece of their identity. Mm-hmm. And until they had that, they didn't feel whole. Yeah. And that's what prompted them to do the kind of searches they did, some successfully, some not.
Yeah, but also if we're looking at also from a completely different perspective, the medical reason,
yes.
Sometimes, knowing if someone has a disease or tracing back or compatibility of organs, so that might, maybe not be the first reason. That's why. But once people started to age or might have, as I said, a condition, knowing
Absolutely.
where the gene pool comes from, it might be very important.
It's critical. And the Italian government, and they're not budging on this, there's been a lot of advocacy. They have sealed these files for 100 years. And when I was talking to you about my translator crying during a Zoom interview, it was related to that the adoptee had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She miraculously survived it, but at the time she was a widow. Her husband was a police officer killed chasing a mafia gang. So she was a widow with 3 children. She had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. None of the treatments were working. The doctors said to her, you have to petition the courts, the Italian courts, to get your records. We need to do a bone marrow transplant. And the courts denied it. And the woman went into a coma. She actually had written the will to make sure all her children could be adopted in one family, excuse me. And it was a complete miracle that she survived this, but the courts would not budge. So absolutely, this is really, really essential. Another un-American adoptee, she had 3 cesarean sections. And each time the doctor said, what's your family history? I don't know. Why do we know more about the pedigree of cats and dogs, the animals we have, than people have an adoptee has about their own origins and what those medical records are? So those are really critical issues.
So how long has the book been out in Italy, and how long has the book been out in the US? And were you surprised about the reaction and interest in the different geographical areas?
Yeah, the book came out last September in Italy in translation, translated by Alba Bariffi. And that was really a wonderful and very, very interesting experience. And the book came out in English last month. I was extremely fortunate that 60 Minutes, thank you, that 60 Minutes was interested in this story. And the book came out right after that episode aired. October 15th was my book. I guess that was the 13th. And yes, it's been it's been very, very interesting. In Italy last January, Vanity Fair Italia did a piece on John Campitelli, and the response was just really amazing. The journalist who wrote it told me it was, the #1 story in Vanity Fair, online for like a month. Italians were very eager and interested to hear these stories, to what was going on. I wish there was more of a discussion in Italy than there is. In the fact of what I say is that, in Ireland has kind of made peace with the Magdalene laundries, and they haven't made peace with it, but they talk about it, and they've advocated for reforms for women that have been very, very much needed because of the Magdalene laundries. I think in Italy in general, there's still not a lot of talk about the homes for unwed mothers, or the brevet trophy that existed all throughout the country. And I think that's, I think that's kind of a lost opportunity. And in the same way that the Italians are one of the few places that haven't really addressed the child sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. They just don't want to talk about these things. And I just find it really interesting that the Irish have found a voice to talk about it, and I don't think the Italians have yet.
Indeed. Any last message? I mean, obviously, this is probably a big takeaway that you would like to share about your book, and also, if people are part of this program, can they contact you? Do you want to be contacted? Do you want to hear more stories? Or because it
Yes,
might be
absolutely. People I have a website, marialaurino.com, and I've been adoptees and other have been reaching out through that. And yes, I'm always interested in hearing these stories. I think this has affected many people in I'll give you a statistic. By the late 1950s, there was an estimated 200,000 children in the brevet trophy. So this has affected a lot of people in Italy and in America. And yeah, takeaway message. This was a time when women had no choices, and we have to be very careful that we don't make the mistakes of the past. This shaming of women continues today, continues around the world. The mechanisms in which the children were surrendered anonymously are now also in place in the United States. That's happened only very recently, that we've made legal this kind of anonymous abandonment of children, which I find disturbing. And that I think that there are lessons for today in this story too, some very important lessons at this time and juncture in our history.
Well, unfortunately, our time together is up. Il Big Ben ha detto stop, and it's time for us to say arrivederci e alla prossima. We want to thank you for tuning in into the program. If you have any questions or comments, or if you have any topics you would like us to address, please contact us at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, subscribe to the Italian Radio Hour on YouTube or where you catch your favorite podcasts. I would like to thank my guest, Maria Laurino, our sponsors, Istituto Mondo Italiano, La Prima Espressos, and Wallis. And until next time, alla prossima. Ciao, ciao.